suggested a ground incursion into Venezuela. However, Maduro denounced the buildup as a threat of invasion. And joining me live, I would like to welcome Brian Fonseca, director of the Jack D. Gordon Institute for Public Policy and an adjunct professor in the Department of Politics and International Relations at Florida International University. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. Let's start with how far you think the Trump administration would be willing to go here. We have CNN reporting this week that at some point it was considering strikes inside Venezuela, but that would be a huge escalation, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think right now we're at a critical juncture. U.S. military pressure is real. The Maduro government is steadfast in terms of rooted in the ground. And I think the world is waiting to see whether or not there's a military escalation. I think the prospects of the United States militarily further engaging in Venezuelan sovereign space is absolutely real. The military buildup in Puerto Rico alone suggests that there's an incredible intensity in terms of the amount of military assets that the U.S. has deployed and is likely willing to use those assets to target drug-related targets inside Venezuela if it decides it's going to go that far.
It seems like Venezuela is also taking it seriously as well. We had Maduro warning of an American invasion. Now he's urging the president to engage in dialogue. How do you think the regime is looking at this?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that the regime has also mobilized. It's mobilized over 1 million militia around the country. It's also beefed up assets on the border with Guyana and coastal areas in which it's attempted to at least bolster some of its own military response in more of a defensive posture, despite the fact that its military is not capable of defending against the Americans. And I don't think the U.S. is looking for a ground invasion necessarily, unless it, of course, escalates that. But certainly strategic strikes from some of the F-35s that have been positioned in Puerto Rico is very likely in sort of the coming days, weeks, or months, while sort of the U.S. military presence is situated in the Caribbean.
I also want to talk to you about sanctions here and how these can be used as a tool against the regime. You've argued that Washington taking a hard line against the regime in terms of sanctions has the potential to, and has in the past, actually pushed Venezuela to engage more deeply with American adversaries, places like China. What alternative would you see to put pressure on the regime that is not necessarily military?
Yeah, I mean, I think sanctions is a form of pressure, but right now what that does is it means that Americans aren't on the ground engaging and building leverage in Venezuela in an effort to sort of shape policy on the ground in Venezuela. And I think what that's done is it has pushed Venezuela to deal more with China, Russia, Iran. If you look at the exports of oil, particularly in the absence of Chevron being on the ground in Venezuela, much of that oil has moved to China. And so I think what the sanctions have done, in the absence of any other broader impactful policy, and certainly in the absence of leverage on the ground, it has pushed Maduro closer to American rivals, and it's given American rivals more access to the Western Hemisphere. And so I think that's detrimental. I think military pressure is certainly in the mix right now. I think, again, how do we build more leverage on the ground in Venezuela over the long term so that we can put pressure, policy pressure, through our domestic engagement in ways that moves the country back towards a flourishing democracy, which it has had in the past.
And what's the right balance there? How would you go about trying to build that leverage?
Yeah, so I think certainly targeted sanctions are good. Putting sanctions on individuals that have continued to induce corruption and do things like illicit trafficking and things that sort of undermine sort of the broader security and solvency of government landscape. I think the broader sectoral sanctions have been sort of less effective. And I think that what that has done is, again, kept American businesses out of Venezuela. And I think that means that it's left us with an absence of sort of leverage on the ground, meaningful leverage that can affect change. And so I do think that you keep targeted sanctions in place, but you broaden back sort of sectoral sanctions, issue things like specific licenses, move American businesses back in the ground to, one, sort of outcompete our rivals in Venezuela, but also build up leverage on the ground in Venezuela.
Brian, this has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time to share your expertise when speaking with Brian Fonseca.